It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Not okay.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror. I'm James.
I'm Paul.
And Dad, on today's episode, to tell a horror story, sometimes you don't need monsters or ghouls or zombies or vampires. Sometimes the scariest things you can encounter are men.
Right.
Because today we are talking about Alex Garland's new horror film, Men. The latest from A24. It was released on May 20th, 2022. This is the third feature from Alex Garland as a director/writer. He did Ex Machina and Annihilation, two sci-fi films that I liked a lot. This is him kind of dipping into horror. I think for the sake of this review, there's a lot to talk about with a lot of what's going on, and so I think initially we'll do a quick kind of spoiler-free general thoughts, impressions, and then we'll give a very clear indication when we're going to go full spoilers because there was a lot to get into. So, non-spoiler, Dad, what did you think of Men?
I liked it very, very much. It does pick up on classic Gothic themes of the heroine in distress that goes all the way back to the 18th century, but certainly is a mainstay of all kinds of literature. Think of stories like Rebecca, or you think of Gaslight. All of these ones where there's a threatened heroine by some evil person, and that shows up also in the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film adaptations. And I think this draws heavily on that, but it also presents some new things. So it definitely introduces us to the classic Gothic structure of English horror films. We're in a manor house in a deserted area with strange people showing up. All those things that are part of that whole tradition. I found it challenging, but overall I would rate it very, very good, very highly. They take all those traditional forms and then blend them into something that's not totally new, but is insightful and provocative.
Yeah, I also really like the movie a lot. I think both its advantage and maybe disadvantage is that it's saying a lot very on the nose, as you can imagine. I mean, the movie's literally called Men, but it also has a lot of ambiguity to it with some of its ideas and its imagery. And I think the two don't always coalesce, but when they do, I think it works really well. And overall, I was definitely impressed with it. I think it is creepy. I think Alex Garland just has a very solid grasp on setting a mood and then sustaining that mood. And as you said, like you're going to this countryside. It's a very scenic sort of location, but at the same time, it's also inviting of a very kind of menacing sort of tone. Again, once we go into spoilers, we'll get into some of what it's actually saying with its themes and stuff. But as like a genre exercise, I think it worked really well. I like the pace. It's very much a slow burn. It gets pretty wild in the third act, which again we'll get into. But overall, I liked it. I think if you like A24 horror, it's definitely one to check out. Okay, well, I think in that regard, I think it's time to kind of dive right into it. So from this point on, we are going to be spoiling the new movie Men. So if you haven't seen it yet, hit pause, come back to this. This is the warning. So count down 3, 2, 1. So Men. I think we can kind of right off the bat say, as we see very early on, we see that Jessie Buckley, our main character, who plays Harper, she's leaving the city to go to this very remote kind of countryside manor where she's greeted by this host named Jeffrey, who's
she's going to be like a taking care of things. She's taking housekeeper. I'm sorry, she's like basically a housekeeper.
Yeah. Well, we see from the very first image that we understand to be her husband commits suicide, and over the course of the film we get all these flashbacks to kind of show that they're about to be separated and the sort of like toxicity between them. But she's clearly escaping. I think she just wants to get away from all of that and kind of have a moment to herself. It's like very much like an Airbnb. Mm-hmm. And she's greeted by Jeffrey, who's very kind of awkward and weird, but seems kind of harmless initially. But then I think for me at least, it very early on, we very clearly get the sense that we're in a folk horror movie. I mean, it's set in this scenic countryside. We see these creepy naked men in the forest. We get some pagan imagery.
Yeah.
And then also, we'll just say it as a spoiler, Jeffrey is played by Rory Kinnear. He plays all of the men in this little like kind of village.
So they're all manifestations of the same kind of problem.
Which you could say is sort
Yeah.
of a take on the men are all the same. But he plays Jeffrey. He plays the police officer. He plays the naked man. He plays the priest. He even plays the boy who has the mask. I think there's a little bit of like CGI there to kind of make him look different. But so yeah, I mean, I think it's a very deliberate choice to have this actor portraying all of them. And I think what the film's doing with that is we're seeing toxic masculinity sort of manifesting in multiple ways. I mean, as we understand it in these flashbacks, you know, she's about to divorce her husband James, and he's threatening to kill himself, and it's almost like sort of saying like this is going to be on your conscience. And she's like, wait a minute, you can't threaten me that way. And then again, over the course of these flashbacks, we see him physically hit her, and she kind of orders him out. And it's shortly after that he jumps out of the window and kills himself.
Yeah.
Very kind of graphic image that she's replaying in her head. And so as she kind of is approached by these different men, she gets different forms of toxic behavior where she's being blamed for the suicide. She's being downplayed when she sees a stalker. And so obviously with the title Men, I think Alex Garland is clearly, you know, he's making some obvious statements about how a woman, you know, is confronted with these real life horrors on a regular basis, but using it in a very fantastical, almost fairy tale like, I think, setting.
It makes me think of Jane Eyre. Again, I think it works off of these classic archetypes or classic literary sources. But you think of, you know, Jane Eyre is the same case that comes to a remote manor house and she doesn't know all that's going on there. And there's this Mr. Rochester. If you've ever seen the early, I think it's a 1941 film with Orson Welles as Rochester, there is again this same kind of sense of a innocent young woman who is walking into a trap, in a sense, in this old manor house. There's any number of Sherlock Holmes stories where we're hearing about threatened governesses or women servants. So it taps into a rich vein of Victorian literature and types, but it also picks up this kind of theme about men replacing women. I mean, this is, I think, is one thing that comes through this is that these men really don't need women, and that's why you have these phenomenal scenes of men giving birth. It is the idea that women are really very secondary.
Well, yes, I think we can definitely get into the ending in a second, but also I think going off what you're saying about the Victorian sort of context. Also, I mean, very obviously a lot of biblical allegory. I mean, right as soon as she arrives at this manor, she sees a apple tree, takes an apple, bites it. Clearly forbidden fruit. Even Jeffrey makes a sort of joke about that. So clearly she's presented as this Eve-like character, and even seeing the kind of like creepy naked man that's sort of following her, I think that obviously has a lot of sort of pagan sort of connotation.
But he's got antlers in his hair and flowers. And
well, I was going to say, I think clearly that's meant to be almost like an Adam type character, and the leaves are almost like when the sort of the shame of hiding yourself. And then when we get into the church where we have the priest, she's in this church, but we see this kind of pagan imagery, which I was looking up online to kind of get some more context for that. And it sounds like the male thing is supposed to be this green man, and the female is this Sheila Nagig. And the green man historically represents rebirth, which again we see very literally in the ending. But I think over the course of the film, that naked man starts to portray that image even more. And it's almost like when she first goes out into the woods and it's kind of in that big tunnel and starts sort of like echoing. It's in a way she's almost like summoning this in some way. And clearly she's working through a lot of emotions, and all of this sort of like toxicity is a way to kind of abuse her. And as you said, she's very much literally in a man's world where there's no room for women and there's no room for kind of her voice to sort of really, really speak.
And men can't be trusted. And whether they're authority figures like the police or the priest or the landlord, again, they're all being portrayed by the same actor, but they're all dangerous figures for her. And she has to kind of come to terms with that. Again, I think this fits fits a pattern too of the woman in distress that nobody will believe. Something as recent as Rosemary's Baby. Remember the story there? Rosemary goes to all kinds of people to get help, and ends up always talking to somebody who's part of the witchcraft circle that's got her trapped in where she's going to have to give birth to the son of Satan. But she keeps going to these, whether it's her husband or a psychiatrist, or all these people that should be there to help her, and they're not at all. In fact, they're on the other side. And that's kind of the dilemma here of the heroine. She's reaching out for help, and she's going to authority figures for that help, but it's not there.
What I think that's what works really well to the film is that each character, even though they are the same actor, each character is showing a different form of toxic masculinity. We have some gaslighting in here. We have, right as we understand the relationship with her husband, she's saying that she's going to leave him. They're separating, and he's kind of throwing it to her like, oh, this is your fault that we're getting divorced. It's going to be your fault if I kill myself. It's very much like this kind of abusive, like emotional abuse, and we see that also manipulate in the different men and how she comes into contact with them. And then as we get to the ending where it's this very literal, like graphic portrait of men birthing more men, it's very much this idea of kind of like almost like the passing down of toxic masculinity from one generation to another. But also, again, it's taking birth, which is obviously a very kind of female role, and sort of exploiting that in a very kind of graphic and distressful way.
We have a few brief references to Greek mythology. Agamemnon from the Trojan War gets mentioned. And of course, what's striking about Greek mythology, and especially about Zeus, the king of the gods, who's very masculine and is having sexual relationships with almost anything that moved, nonetheless is able to give birth. And that's a formidable idea that Athena is born out of his forehead, out of the top of his head. Dionysius is born out of his thigh. So that idea of men giving birth to maintain masculine dominance is a very ancient one, and
that's also kind of, you could say the same thing with Adam, sort of born out of Adam. It's this, and I think that's something else that to me the film does well. It's taking these very kind of ancient sort of religious origins, or in this case, like you said, like mythological origins, and showing how obviously toxic masculinity is nothing new. It has a very kind of old, ancient sort of origins, and seeing how this sort of manifests in kind of repeated ways.
In the dramatic versions of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, by that I mean the plays and movies, not the original novella, there is this idea that the threatened heroine goes to Jekyll pleading for help, and he agrees to give it to her. But what she doesn't know and what he can't control is that he turns into Hyde in the interim and goes out stalking her to take revenge upon her. And again, it says that same kind of theme shows up here. You're going to these people who should be there to help you, but they're not. And I think that's a very powerful statement, especially in the Me Too era, where women are looking for some kind of male support for their protection and their guidance, and they don't get it.
Absolutely. And then also too, I want to kind of talk about the very end, because we have, like I said, we had this whole very, very extreme scene with these men literally birthing more men, and it's so very clearly apparent this is meant to symbolize the way that this sort of toxicity is, and
it's very gross too.
It's very gross. Yes, it's definitely an image that'll linger in my head rent free. But obviously, the last one we see is her husband, and that one he kind of sits down on the couch, and she asks like, "What do you want from me?" And she says, "Your love." And she goes like, "Yeah." It's kind of like that to me is again this toxic, idea of like, well, it's your fault that we're getting divorced. It's your fault that all this is happening. But then right after that, we get the men logo. But then it cuts back to her. I'm not sure if it's a friend or the sister, but one of her female allies, we'll say, who she kind of is talking to over FaceTime over the course of the movie, and says she'll come. She arrives at the end, and she gets out of the car, and we notice she's pregnant, which I think is a very key detail. But we see how Harper's car was crashed, and we see her sitting on the steps, and we see that she has blood on her. But I read that whole scene as very kind of optimistic because she smiles seeing a friend. And again, I think after this very graphic sequence of the men, I think seeing a pregnant woman kind of is a more optimistic, hopeful sort of a takeaway of like here's birth in a maternal sense with a more hopeful kind of future, if you will. But so then, how do you then interpret the ending? Are we supposed to take things literally? Do you think some of this is more maybe psychological versus actually happening? Because all those events are there, but we just see her by herself.
I think though that the friend, who comes at the end, is the link with reality. This is not something she's imagining. She calls out to this friend, gives her the information, tells her where the country estate is, and the friend comes to see her. And I think that's that idea that she has survived this terrible trauma of these men, and now she's going to escape. And I think that's the idea there too, that the friend is there to represent an outside source of reality that she can depend upon. She couldn't depend upon the men to help her, but her friend really will help her and will get her out of there.
Absolutely. And then a question that I was thinking about in the context of kind of where we are with horror is, I've noticed that with a lot of recent horror films, they've been tackling these kind of real world terrors very directly. So I think of, Get Out with racism, or Hereditary with generational trauma. And, so obviously this with men and sort of the toxic masculinity. How do you, Dad, think that horror becomes like a useful commentary for these issues?
Well, I think the whole nature of horror is to reflect the concerns going on in the society at the time that it's being written, produced, filmed, or whatever else. And I think that's the advantage of horror, that it deals with our fundamental fears. And in that regard, we face into things we don't want to think about, but things that are real. One of the things, you go back and look at the classic horror films, beginning with the silent era up through the mid-30s. Think of Lon Chaney and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and The Phantom of the Opera, and then of course Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, and later on as disfigured criminal in The Raven. And all of this is what this is doing, and this has been documented in some studies. This is showing what actual people veterans returning from World War I actually looked like. That they had to have reconstructed faces from being blown up by shells and shot at with machine guns. And so the idea of a Phantom of the Opera where there's no nose. Well, there were people like that walking around who had no nose visibly, or terribly scarred, like Boris Karloff in several of these films. So I think that the advantage of the horror film is it's telling us what we're afraid of. What's the concern? And certainly the original Frankenstein is a concern about science. And when we get into the 50s, the Curse of Frankenstein goes beyond that. And we're talking about not just science in general, but the nuclear arms race in particular. So I think that's the real advantage of horror. Now, it can just sort of portray that without giving us any insight as to how to deal with it. The better horror films will raise these issues of, okay, here's the problem. How do you deal with this? Frankenstein, it talks about the loss of humanity coming about through science in the nature of the creature, the monster. Well, the next question then gets to be, how do we reaffirm humanity with these kind of repercussions, with these kind of negative forces at work? And that comes out again and again. And it becomes also a recall to faith. The fact that you have a corrupt priest here doesn't take away from the message of redemption that's in the church. We don't really see that, but it's there, even with the strange kind of is it neo-pagan or green man kind of images that we see in there as well. But nonetheless, the cross stands over everything else. It's still there. It still speaks a word, even if the minister, the priest, is not being faithful in proclaiming it. It's still there. And I think there's these encouraging points in this. But that's the advantage of the horror film, is that it forces us to face issues that we may not want to really face, but that are there and need to be confronted.
And I think going off that too, I think what this movie does really well, which again, like something like Get Out does too, is like it is very timely in so many ways, but also shows that these are not new issues. Like women are going to deal with abuse from men always have, and maybe always will. But what I like too is that, you know, from the very beginning of just the idea of her husband, who again she's already has these complicated emotions because they're separating, who commits suicide. That's already a huge trauma that could be a very real fear for someone. But then what this movie I think does so well is it takes it so much further by exploiting that trauma to sort of make these men kind of gaslight her to be like, oh well if you, I guess the priest says like, oh well, if you had just let him apologize, maybe he wouldn't have committed suicide. It's like it's this victim blaming, and what I love too about the priest is not only is that something he does, but then later on he accuses her of tempting him by being a woman. So it's kind of like, you know, but again, I think all this is showing, you know, very real horrors that a woman could deal with, and is sort of unable to sort of process grief in a healthy way when this is the kind of adversity she's up against.
And the fact that she's there to kind of be a caretaker of the house reaffirms this classic image of the woman takes care of the house. She cleans the house and she washes the dishes and then takes care of the children, and that's really all that a woman is there for. And so she's getting set up that way. She's being brought in to basically be the housekeeper, take care of cleaning the house and keeping it in order and so forth. And in reality, she's surrounded by all these malevolent forces. But to start with, she's not being taken seriously beyond the fact she's just a servant. And so, in that sense, she's being diminished by these men who then are going to go beyond that and start stalking her and finally even attacking her.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I don't know if she's necessarily the caretaker, but to me it's like an Airbnb. She's going as like a getaway, you know. So she might have some of that duty, but I think it's mostly her just kind of, again, she wants to escape from her world for a little bit to kind of have a change of scenery and clear her mind a little bit. And what I like too about kind of the way the movie's filmed and the, you know, very lush cinematography is we get early on these very scenic shots of her kind of walking through the woods, and it's very the movie has these kind of pervading use of like green and red is usually when there's something kind of bad going on, and green initially is almost like contrasting that by being very like blissful and serene. But then very quickly we see how all of a sudden there's a hint of threat, and then that sort of turns the wheel a little bit, where all of a sudden now she's sort of vulnerable in this big open remote area, and even when she initially calls the police because of this, you know, naked man that's following her, she doesn't even quite know where she is. So it kind of shows how vulnerable you become when you're out of your element.
Yeah, I think I do think she is being kind of set up as in the image of a servant by the landlord, even though she obviously wants to probably get away too to rest up. But I think that she's in a subservient position right from the very beginning, and even where she gets criticized for having eaten one of the apples. The apples are falling from the tree. This is that whole idea of the original sin, kind of forbidden fruit, but that she gets criticized for that. And when you go and throughout the film, there are a number of scenes where apples just keep falling off the tree. So it's not as though that, and even the landlord says that there's no special need to take care of the apples because they just keep coming, and more of them fall off. They can actually be eaten. So please help yourself, kind of a thing. But again, she's being very much directed by a male leader, a male authority figure, and told what she can do and not do. One thing I question, I think we talked about this before, is there's this very spacious country estate, and there's a music room with a piano. And early on, the landlord asked her, "Do you play the piano?" And she says no. But then later in the film, we see her playing the piano, and I wasn't exactly sure what that represented.
Yeah, I sort of took that to make it seem like she's being a little bit reticent with some of her personal life, because even she sort of mistakenly puts her surname, and he's like, "Oh, Mrs. Marlowe, like, where's your husband?" And she kind of alludes to that oh, they're getting divorced, but doesn't really say that he's committed suicide.
Yeah.
And so I agree that was sort of an interesting choice, but that to me was just kind of her trying to keep herself a bit private.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, well, kind of final impressions. Anything you want to end on?
I think it's a very provocative film. I think it clearly part of a long-standing tradition, but I think it adds to that tradition as something reflected. And I think it's an interesting film to discuss. I think it'd be a very interesting film to discuss in mixed gender groups, men and women together, to talk about what's going on there. So I was basically very impressed with it.
As was I. I mean, for me, Alex Garland is 3 for 3 now. I like to see him kind of, venture into, like I said, more folk horror and dealing with this very kind of overt symbolism. And yeah, I mean, I've seen it now twice, and I think both times I appreciate what it's saying and kind of unpacking some of these ideas. And yeah, I mean, I love all the sort of technicality. I love the sound design. I love the score. The cinematography is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a really well made film, and is another to me example of like a very solid A24 horror film. So I would definitely recommend seeing Men.
Me too. So I think that's enough for now. And I'm Paul.
I'm James.
And we'll catch you later. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror.
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that one again.
Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.